Okay, good afternoon, everyone, here in the room, here on Zoom. I'm very happy to see so many faces, familiar faces and new faces. Thank you for coming. It's my great pleasure to welcome Emilka Skrzypek from the University of St. Andrews. To the Beyond Hot Air lecture today at the University of Vienna. And Emilka is anthropologist working at the University of St. Andrews. And you are also a honorary senior researcher at the Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland. And Emilka has around 15 years of experience in research on extractive industries in Papua New Guinea and in the Pacific in general. And you will introduce your work focus now at the beginning of your talk, but it's very important that I also mention that Emilka is the co-lead of the Energy Ethics Institute at the University of St. Andrews. And you should really check this out, this institute. They're doing great work. And I have put also into the chat the link to the project Beyond Hot Air, conversations around critical raw materials supply for the green transition. And today is the lecture number 2 in this series. And I welcome now also the audience that listens to us maybe in a few weeks. Emilka, the floor is yours. I switch off my microphone.
Thank you very much, Gertie, and welcome everyone. I will be sharing my attention visually between the camera and the screen here and people in the room, just so that everyone feels equally included, regardless of whether they were here in beautiful Vienna or whether they're dialing in online now, or as Gertie says, possibly in the future. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for a warm welcome. As Gertie said, my name is Emilka. I'm based at St. Andrews. I would call myself an accidental anthropologist. But I am anthropologist nevertheless, mostly working on issues related to extraction and resource governance and the interplay between the big global processes and local realities and local structures and how the interplay between them works. And most recently, my attention has turned to how climate change and extractivism kind of coexist in the Pacific and are experienced together and are managed together, and what kinds of challenges that creates. And as Gertie mentioned, I'm also the Deputy Director of the Center for Energy Ethics. I'm putting a QR there if you would like to find out more about our work. We're an interdisciplinary center, bringing together academics, but also creating platform for academics, industry, policy people, and community members to come and be able to engage in critical but constructive conversations about all matters energy. So please do sign up to our newsletter if that sounds like something that might be of interest to you. And one thing to flag just at the very beginning, and I already mentioned it to some of the people in the room, is that in August 2026, we are planning a big conference on the theme of infrastructures of energy. The panel proposals deadline is today, so good luck. But we will also be accepting open paper as well as paper for panels proposals later in June. So feel warmly invited to join the conversation in person in St. Andrews or hybrid next August. Now, a couple of other things before I move on to the subject of the talk today is that you are very much seeing me here today, but I am one of 3. I am part of a group who has worked on this project, and I would like to introduce to you the other two people involved and instrumental in the kinds of ideas and work I will be talking to you about today. The first is Associate Professor Nick Bainton at the Australian National University, who has about 25 years of experience working in extractive contexts in the Pacific, including 7 years of working for a mining company, which I think creates some really unique insights there. So that's him on one side of the screen. On the other side, we have Dr. Eleanor Lebre from University of Queensland, CSRM, and she currently works within the Complex Ore Bodies program in collaboration with some of the other researchers at SMI across the research centers there. And her research is focused on using global data and data sets on mining projects and ESG metrics, which I will be talking about in quite some detail today, to assess risks associated with operating mines, but also new discoveries. And I hope it will become quite clear over the course of the next 45 minutes or so how those three people and those three areas of expertise fit well together. But every story needs to have a beginning because we need to have some kind of arc. So one of the beginnings for this story is a British Academy project. We got a pot of money from the BA that goes back 2-3 years ago now for a project called Just Transitions and the Pacific. And as our aim on the project was to produce empirical knowledge on the justice dimensions of extracting critical metals in the Pacific, but also identify if and how the concept of a just transition can provide a new framework for responsible extraction of those metals from the Pacific region. Now, the answer to that question was like, yes-ish. We found that the just transitions and the just project framework and framing only got us this far. So it was productive and constructive to a point, but then things evolved. And it's very much this kind of next evolutionary stage of this process of thinking that I would like to tell you about today, which is a recent paper of ours that examines one particularly wicked problem, when the solution to a complex issue actually serves to amplify exposure to the same amplifying issues, right? So for us, our thinking is about how solution to climate change amplifies exposure to effects of climate change. And what are some of the feedback loops that we think we should really start looking at quite critically? There is a QR code there. The paper is open access, so do feel free to take a look for a more detailed description. But in the meantime, I will try today to give a sort of a narrative version of the problem of compound exposure, as we termed it, and how we've tackled it in our paper and our work to date. And I will finish with some ideas for next steps, and also eager to hear from you about where do you think this all might go. Now, I'm mindful that in the room we have some people who know a lot about mining and critical metals, some people who know less. We also have some people who know a lot about the Pacific, and some people who know less. So in structuring this presentation, we've been very mindful of those different audiences, and I should also probably flag that it's me delivering it, but the presentation is also co-authored by Nick. Okay, so let's start this theoretical consideration by establishing a couple of things we know. So by now, we are all fairly well versed in the primary solution to climate change, which is this rapid energy transition to renewable energy. Notwithstanding global commitment to fossil fuel capitalism, pressure is mounting to enact this transition and to enact it as soon as possible. There is this kind of sense of urgency. In many respects, and in the dominant discourse, this solution is conceived in unproblematic terms, right? A simple swapping of one source of energy for another, allowing most of other parts of our lives to continue quite uninterrupted. Now, I will not dwell today here on the different types of renewable energy technologies, and I will not dwell on the technical, political, or economic challenges of enacting this transition, whilst acknowledging how important those questions are. But for now, the main point is that energy transition has become this dominant solution to our shared planetary climate crisis. And as the crisis deepens, the more urgent the need for action on climate change. So we have this element of urgency, as I mentioned just a moment ago, in energy transition in the name of climate action, although we are also seeing that framing shifting towards geopolitical aspects, energy security. But it's the transition in the name of climate action that is the focus of this paper here today. So that was the point one that I wanted to establish. Now, point two, also by now quite widely accepted, is that we know that building all this new energy infrastructure is going to require a lot of raw minerals. It is a big conversation and it is getting louder, which is good to see. The mining industry has been very quick to seize this point, promoting itself as essential to climate solutions. In other words, the energy transition is generating enormous demand for certain commodities, which in turn is generating enormous pressure to open new mines or expand and extend the lifespans of existing operations. Now, in its current form, the energy transition will be built off the back of the mining industry, right? And this idea is that somehow we are going to mine our way out of this crisis and mine our way towards planetary survival. Now, ignorant to the fact, perhaps, that it was mining, coal and extraction of fossil fuels that got us into this whole mess in the first place, right? So we're seeing when the source of the problem is now rebranded as the source of the solution, right? Extractive hegemony and the strength of extractive capitalism like on full show in these conversations. And they're kind of how difficult it is to shift some of the pillars of those conversations about extractivism. Okay, so in the context of the energy transition, now that we've established the energy transition as the dominant solution and the resource demands of this transition in the form it is being enacted, in this context, we often hear a talk about critical metals and Beyond Hot Air Project and its members and affiliates probably know about it much more than most. Now, critical minerals and metals are those defined by nations as being critical to their needs, right? So we're seeing emergence of this term initially during the First World War with war minerals, and it evolved to a broader understanding of materials essential or critical for national defense and economic stability. And the term has been evolving since as needs of those countries and societies change. But the bottom line is that there is no universal list of critical minerals. Individual countries define it differently. How they define it will also change over time. So our colleagues at the University of Queensland decided instead to coin and develop this term energy transition minerals and metals to describe a much more specific category of materials we are talking about here. Right, so I will refer to them as ETMs, and I promise it's going to be the only acronym I will use regularly here. So if you hear ETMs, it's energy transition minerals and metals. So those ones that are needed for development of new energy infrastructure. Now, as a term, on the one hand, is much more specific. On the other hand, is more encompassing and global, right? In taking away some of the subjectivity. Now, you have a list here on the screen in a table of those that this term considers as ETMs. And it includes some things that we expect, like rare earths or copper, but also bulk commodities like iron ore, for example, which are possibly less frequently talked about in relation to the energy transition, and yet are integral to enacting that transition. Now, of all of these, in the dominant solution to climate change, we will need more. Right? And we will need much more to not only develop the technology that we need, but also to develop it as at a sufficient scale that is needed to actually make any change to the changing climate and get at least remotely closely to net zero. Okay, so how much are we talking about? And what are the future mineral projections? Now, the figures on the screen here come from the International Energy Agency's Global Critical Minerals Outlook for 2024. And broadly speaking, what these graphs show is the increasing amounts of materials needed between now and 2040 to meet the net zero energy targets. Now, don't worry if you cannot see the detail, but I'm hoping you can see the two different colors on the screen there. Now, the light blue, so that's the bottom of those bars, shows the amount needed for clean energy projects. Right? But there is the thing, there is also the dark blue, and the dark blue shows how much is needed over time and how much demand will increase for uses that have absolutely nothing to do with clean energy. Okay? Infrastructures and technologies that underpin our lives and life's kind of cycles and life systems as they are now in our modern existence, including things such as defense systems, right? Which can, in the moral and ethical conversations about mining for the greater good, have a slightly different ring to it. Defense systems and guns versus, renewable energy technologies. So these images tell many stories, as statistics do. In my previous life, I was an anthropologist working for the Office of Chief Statistician in the Scottish government. So very versed with the stories told by statistics. But there is one that particularly jumps out of these graphs here for us today, that as much as energy transition is needed and will require a good deal of raw materials, this solution is largely premised on maintaining the status quo in our consumption-heavy lives, right? It doesn't actually touch on some of the causes of the issues, which is, for example, the level of consumption and our relationship and use of natural resources. It's more premise of replacing like for like, rather than rethinking the relationships that these graphs demonstrate. Now, it also helps to highlight how the energy transition has really given the extractive industries a free pass, in some ways at least. More mining is justified in the name of the energy transition, even though a good deal of this mining is for things unrelated to climate action. Right, but there is this discourse that the industry can use and has been using and is using to say we need this to save the planet. Now, more mining will do a lot of things, and amongst them, it will generate more risks to societies and to environments, to geopolitical stability. Some of us spent a great afternoon discussing geopolitics of these processes. So taking this as a starting point, our colleagues at the University of Queensland went about building a data set to look at these problems more specifically, more methodologically at a global scale. Right? And this is where Eleanor's work comes in. So working with the S&P Global Database, Eleanor and a group of other colleagues at the University of Queensland identified some 5,000 ETM mining projects worldwide. And these are projects that are either operating and extracting or planning and proposing to extract. So there are different levels of the mine life cycle. Now, once they've identified those projects, they went about developing a set of spatial data layers for each of those projects across 7 key indicators for social, environmental, and governance risks in these locations, right? And that is further broken down to 70 odd variables. And you can see that the major indicator categories here, which is nature conservation, water, extreme events, communities, social vulnerability, land uses, and governance. So it's this huge layered data set where they set out to identify, well, the first challenge that they faced, I think, was to identify global data sets that are comparable globally, right? That they can actually capture and find at the level. You know, I'm looking at Simon in the corner. New Caledonia is always tricky because for national data sets, it falls under France, but the circumstances are incredibly different, right? So the first challenge is to actually find out what do we know and how can we organize what we know. But what it did is allowed them to identify embedded levels of vulnerability and risks surrounding each one of those 5,000 odd ETM projects. In other words, it allowed them to assess which projects and which regions are most exposed to impacts of mining, where those vulnerabilities and the risks are greater than in other places. A very complex and versatile picture, as I'm sure you can imagine. But the gist of it is that many of those projects, particularly in the undeveloped category, where there's exploration or feasibility studies, are becoming increasingly complex, you know, in the category of complex ore bodies. So in ecologically and governance vulnerable areas, often on lands belonging to indigenous people, many of those resources are also low grade. So the extraction processes will require more water, more energy, generate a higher volume of waste that has to go somewhere, right? So we're also looking at this shift that all the easy ores have been extracted or to a large extent, and we're increasingly left with the more and more complicated ones. So Eleanor and her colleagues were thinking about it in terms of risk to supply. So answering the question, can we get enough materials for the energy transition? Now, Nick and I, possibly because we're anthropologists, we flipped this question from risk to supply. We were much more interested at risk to people and communities and to places where those projects are located and what this methodology can tell us about that. And we were also more interested in the regional aspect rather than a global aspects for reasons I'm going to move to in just a second. Now, our colleagues in Queensland used the methodology to address several different kinds of questions about relationship between energy transition, extractive industries, and society. And here is just examples of some of the papers that have written and published, including in papers like Nature, which was great to get this conversation going and gain some momentum there. But as I mentioned, their focus is global patterns. Whereas Nick and I, we started wondering about application of this methodology in regional context to look at specific regions to see if we can compare regions. Are some regions more vulnerable than others? Is the risk of mining higher in some regions than in others? And there is one particular region that we were fascinated by for good reasons, which is the South Pacific and the Pacific Islands. Now, again, I know some of you are very familiar with these places, but for those of you who aren't, here is a map of the Pacific Ocean and some almost archival by now photos of Nick up there and me down there during fieldwork in Papua New Guinea. So the Pacific is comprised of some 22 small island developing states, as they would be commonly classified, or large ocean island states, as most Pacific Islanders would much prefer to be referred to. And Nick and I have both been conducting research in that region for a very long time, about 25 years for Nick, about 15 for me. And a lot of that research was ethnographic research on the impacts of the extractive industries in Pacific countries such as Papua New Guinea. Now, in the process, we've been privileged enough to get to know many people and places throughout the islands, and it's a privilege we never take for granted. Now, this has given us intimate understanding of the distressing ways in which daily life rhythms are affected by extraction, right? So we got to very much the ground level of it. So as Eleanor was working on these issues at this global scale and through data sets, we started to ponder what they look at the regional scales and how do they speak to results and what we've seen through our ethnographic works. Now, our personal connection to the Pacific is not the only reason why we're looking at the Pacific here, because it's much by objectively really quite unique and critical positioning of the region in energy transitions and in conversations about extractivism and about climate change. So as another kind of starting point of another theme, we know the Pacific region is already acutely exposed to the effects of climate change. Now, those effects are experienced in different parts of the region in many different ways. Some of them, I think, are quite commonly known, such as coastal erosion, extreme weather patterns, soil salinity. For some of you, it might be surprising to hear that there's issues with frost destroying gardens in countries such as Papua New Guinea as a result of changing climate and changing climate patterns. So it's a really complex picture there. The photo you see on the screen behind me is from Kiribati. And I think it's quite emblematic of a lot of photos when we hear about climate change. It's photos like this we tend to see on blog posts and presentations. And many of them come from the Pacific, which has almost become this poster child for climate catastrophe, right, as a place, as a region. But it also means that it plays a very important role in global conscience and reminding world leaders that climate change is real and that the action is needed. Now, those same leaders tend to debate climate change from comfort of detached, air-conditioned rooms and good catering at places such as COP, right? And from this perspective, it's incredibly easy to ignore climate change as this abstract menace, far away in the future, right? But in places that we are working in, that we're talking about in the Pacific, this is not a discursive or a political problem. This is an existential threat level of a problem to Pacific lives and to Pacific sovereignties, right? So there's very few places on Earth that feel the reef of climate change as much as the Pacific, and that feel the need for action on climate change as much as the Pacific. Now, moving on to the next kind of step of it. So we established that the Pacific is very exposed to climate change, but the region also has a devastating legacy of extractive activities. And since the 1800s, the kind of European and then Australian interests in the Pacific have always one way or another been linked to extractivism and extractive capitalism, be it from sea cucumbers or sandalwood or cheap labor for plantations, right, through mining of resources. So the colonial legacies of the region are deeply entwined with various forms of extractivism, and unsurprisingly, many independent Pacific nations are now heavily dependent on extractive industries for baseline kind of economic survival. These activities have caused environmental devastation, social degradation, and complex patterns of harm. Now, some of this can be explained by the very nature of extraction that takes control of land, uses huge amounts of energy and water, produces large volumes of waste, and that redistributes power and resources and introduces completely new dynamics into complex social, political, and economic systems. Now, one of the photos the photo you see on the screen behind me here is Octedi mine, which is one of the most famous examples of disastrous mining and irresponsible mining, where after a series of industrial accidents, the tailings dam that was half constructed collapsed. The government, for a range of reasons, allowed the company to operate the mine and discharge all toxins and tailings into the Octedi River system, causing what is now very often referred to as slow motion environmental disaster. And for those of you not familiar with this example, look it up. It's fascinating because, again, for a range of complex issues, this mine keeps operating despite the damage it has caused. Now, Pacific is home to many other disastrous mines. And again, photos behind me is from the massive Panguna copper mine on the island of Bougainville off the coast of Papua New Guinea, which was developed in late colonial period and opened just before Octedi. Now, the mine, again, created massive environmental impacts, but it wasn't just the environmental impacts that it has created. Among other factors, that has to be admitted, but it was instrumental in sparking a horrific 10-year civil war that claims thousands of lives, infiltrating every single element of the fabric of social life, and caught up in colonial tensions, strife for sovereignty between Bougainville and Papua New Guinea. And many, many, many years later, decades later, communities are still trying to hold the company Rio Tinto to account for the damage it has caused. Now, while this might be an extreme example, similar processes and conflicts have played out at pretty much every mining project across the region in one way or another. To take another example, the devastating colonial legacy of phosphate mining on the island of Nauru left the island looking like a decimated moonscape, like in that picture here. And it also limited its economic development options, right? So Nauru was forced then to host Australia's offshore detention center in what amounts to, we would call it a human extractivism in a very contemporary form. So in this case, we see how the future of some Pacific nations is overdetermined by the logics of extractive capitalism, the legacy of extractive capitalism, and a legacy that promises to create all this great development and opportunities, but actually often works to limit the options and the pathways forward, leaving behind it a trail of distraction. Now, we are seeing these debates playing out not only at projects where things have already gone terribly wrong. We are also seeing those debates playing out in projects at the initial phases of the life cycle, like the Frida River project, which is one of my main field sites in the Sipik region of Papua New Guinea. It's one of the largest undeveloped gold and copper deposits in the world. And it has been in exploration since the 1960s. Right, so we have a trail of at least 16 documented companies passing on the exploration license, working to find a way to develop these deposits that fit all the kind of criteria for a complex ore body in terms of indigenous lands, in terms of ecological and governance vulnerabilities. And for many, many years, it was considered far too risky and far too expensive. It is in the tributary of the Sipik River, the third largest freshwater system after Amazon and Congo. Right? So the risks, should anything in terms of environmental damage happen at Frida, is absolutely humongous. And when I started working there 15 years ago, the company developing the project said, we can't risk the portfolio of other projects. We can't do it safely. We would rather not do it at all. But there were other companies that were very willing to buy the license from them. So what's happening in the last few years is this Frida River mining project was rebranded the Sipik Development Project, and very much highlighting the role of extractive companies in regional and national development. These are communities that are cut off from a lot of services that we take for granted. They can't get them from their governments. The government says to them, you're too remote, it's not going to happen. Work with the mining company, and mining company very much, jumps onto that discourse. The company website was rebranded with new banners. So the one at the moment is the proposed Frida River project will provide clean, sustainable, and reliable energy. They make this claim on the basis of what they call a hydro dam with a 196-meter embankment, but what is actually a tailing storage facility. So it's a hydro dam that will be used to produce electricity, but all the tailings from mining process and chemicals and toxic waste will be stored behind this dam. Now, hydro dam, you can drain when it comes to the end of its life cycle. Integrated tailing storage facility, you cannot. The chemicals have to stay underwater in perpetuity. Now, the question of who's going to maintain the dam after the mine shuts are completely dismissed at this point in time. It is in the Sipik tributary of this massive freshwater system, and it is not only in a seismic area, it's pretty much bang on a seismic ridge. So this is just to give you an idea of what Frida River project looks like at the moment. The company submitted environmental impact assessment to the government, and I've done a lot of work with local communities and NGOs and lawyers trying to respond to this document, but there's a topic for a different conversation. But it has become incredibly controversial for very, very good reasons. And here's another banner on the website if you stay there long enough. Copper supply is critical for the renewable energy transition and for achieving net zero by 2050. So we have a lot of those projects that had been considered far too risky to develop for a long time, but under the banner of green transition and climate action are having this viability reassessed. And the risks that were unacceptable before suddenly are considered acceptable in the name of planetary survival. Right? So these are not just discursive things, they have real impact on what's happening in the Pacific. Now, against this historical backdrop of mining, including the legacy of exploration at Frida, we know that the Pacific is a rich depository of those minerals and metals needed for the energy transition. And they are found in terrestrial landscapes, but also on deep seabeds of the Pacific Ocean. And there's a lot of, Pacific is one of those sites for experimental deep sea mining and conversations about it. Now, many Pacific nations are already heavily dependent on the extractive industries or are turning to the possibility of seabed mining as a way of generating income to achieve their development goals. And most importantly, to fund activities necessary to deal with the threats and the effects of climate change, right? So we're starting to see feedback loops emerging here. So working from this global data set of 5,000 and odd projects that Eleanor and her colleagues put together, we identified a subset of over 160 ETM projects in the Pacific at various stages of development. And on the map here, you can see the countries where those projects are located and also primary commodities that are either being extracted or proposed to be extracted in those projects. Now, we anticipate that there will be increased pressure to access these resources in the name of energy transition. And we wanted to know how are the risks, what are the risks when these extractive pressures materialize in the forms of greater amount of mining. And we also wanted to know what are the risks when these extractive pressures combine with the already present effects of climate change in the region and also in the specific project locations. So we mapped out pre-existing or what we would call situated social, environmental, and governance vulnerabilities surrounding each one of those 160, I think, 3 projects, which we then compared to the global result. And it's a huge spreadsheet that is DOI'd. You can download it. I'm happy to share it if anybody wants to see what this data set looks like. Now, as I mentioned, for our purposes, we flipped the narrative from risk to supply to risk to people and places. And we used 23 indicators aggregated into the same 7 dimensions of vulnerability that I had on the slide talking about the global data set. Now, overall, compared to the global data set, the Pacific subset paints a very clear picture, although it's not a positive picture. It points to high levels of situated vulnerability around ETM projects in the Pacific across all 7 dimensions considered in our study. And when we compared this with the average results of the global data set, the Pacific consistently scores as higher risk, right? Out of 23 indicators in all but 2 categories. the risk in the Pacific is significantly higher, which again provides us compelling reasons for concern about the increased pressure to extract in the name of energy transition or global security, as it might be, a few months down the line. So what you have here on the screen is comparison between global and Pacific global data set and a Pacific subset. And you can see the one where proximity to community, where the global average risk is higher. We measured it on the basis of communities within a 10-kilometer radius from the project. Now, in the Pacific, it's lower, but it's still at 58%. So 58% of those projects are within 10 kilometers from the nearest community, which is already incredibly high. And if you look at in the context of the next indicator, the mining projects in the Pacific are on average, much more densely populated areas when we consider a 100-kilometer radius there. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we fully anticipate that these situated vulnerabilities will be exacerbated by the pressure to extract, but under pressure to extract under changing environmental conditions, right? So climate change is not something in the future. It's something that is already happening, and we need to consider what impact those changes will have on the vulnerabilities related to risks. So vulnerabilities will be impacted by pressure to extract under changing environmental conditions, which will in turn influence the Pacific countries' capacity to respond to combined shocks and stresses of extraction and climate change, and their capacity to secure a prosperous future for the countries, for the regions, but also for its people. So just to take one set of indicators, for example, 3/4 of these projects are in jurisdictions with low levels of human development compared to only 18% in the global data set, right? So we are looking 75% versus 18%. Some 87% of Pacific ETM projects are in jurisdictions with high income inequalities compared to 59% of the global projects. And this measures signal poverty, insecurity, demographic pressures, and low levels of education and health. And these low-level baseline conditions also mean that local populations are already often ill-prepared to cope with the impacts of extraction, but also with the impacts of climate change. So we've built the data to demonstrate that scramble for Pacific resources will create new perverse patterns of harm and injustice in places that are already exposed to higher than average levels of vulnerability across the environmental, social, and governance indicators. Sorry, am I skipping? No. Okay, so we pressure tested those results then by considering them in light of climate change scenarios. We took the scenario mapping that is available. We looked at the vulnerability indicators of mining projects, and across board, our results show that we can anticipate that the risks and vulnerabilities are already becoming much more severe. And as I said, it's not just in the future. We're already seeing fluctuations in water accessibility, for example, when the communities and the mining projects have to compete for water due to climate change and its effects. What we want to draw attention to is the fact that the primary solution to climate change here is being developed under already perceptible conditions of climate change, right? So close that loop that is so easy to have in our minds from the distance. And we want to expose the underlying context that shape extractive outcomes and also influence capacity to respond to risks and pressures. And we go into quite a lot of detail about it in our paper. But in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to where this all brings us. How do all those elements come together in our thinking and in the kinds of conversations that we want to open up space for, because we feel they're desperately needed. So all this brings me to what we call compound exposure. Now, as we looked at the data in our data set and reflected on the contradictory processes playing out in places like the Pacific, we started to see a broader pattern that we came to call compound exposure. And there is a figure here that is very basic. Neither of us is a graphic designer, but I hope that's going to kind of be sufficient for our purposes today. So working from left to right, just to talk you through our thinking here and this model, we can see a feedback loop between resource extraction and climate change that is reinforced by the need to access ETN. So on the one hand, resource extraction contributes to climate change increases pressure to extract ETNs, but also volatility and risks in the location of proposed or existing extraction. Because as extractive activities are conducted under changing environmental conditions, we see those contexts will become more volatile and large in localized exposure to different forms of harm. Now, on the left, the arrows travel in both ways because some Pacific leaders prioritize extractive-led development. And these decisions also help to reproduce the global extractive industries and their importance. Okay? Now, extractive impacts will be increasingly amplified by the effects of climate change, which are disproportionately experienced throughout the Pacific. Now, at the same time, and this is the right side of the diagram here, Pacific Islanders are amongst the most vocal proponents of climate action, and they work tirelessly to influence international debates and decisions and get across with their ideas and their knowledge and their understanding of what can be done. Now, finally, these situations are not static. Right? They change all the time. New forms of vulnerability are likely to aggravate each other because they will overlap and they will interact across space and time in all those different elements. So what we think we really need to consider is how vulnerability may accumulate or recede in certain places and periods across the life mine cycle, for example, from exploration to operation to closure. And the changes that occur as the feedback loops between problems and proposed solutions compound over time, right? When the solutions and the cause of the problems are a form of the same processes and phenomena. So this idea of compound exposure and this concept, this is where it comes from. You know, our need to draw attention to these contradictions in the dominant solution to climate change, which is a mining-intensive energy transition. The same solution also contributes to climate change and influences local responses to environmental hazards, thus compounding the effects of a changing climate. And whilst there are very few places in the world that feel the urgency of climate action more than the Pacific Islands, we expect that extractive pressures and perils will converge with the impacts of climate change well before the transition to renewables kicks in and reduces climate threats. Right? So this narrative that this mining will help protect the islands from impacts of climate change or reduce the severity of this impact, the timeframes just don't align. Before we see any real difference, a lot of the damage and a lot of harm has already been done. So the Pacific faces a perilous future if climate action is not achieved quickly enough. But how do we prevent regions such as the Pacific becoming sacrifice zones or poorly regulated regional quarries, supplying the rest of the world with raw materials in the name of this global climate solution? Right? These are main questions that are driving our work at the moment. Now, again, you know, this is not an academic or a discursive question. It is a very real challenge that requires real solutions and real action and real leadership on a number of fronts. And the Pacific leaders are grappling with multiple competing interests in this context, right? And needs and threats. And the 2025 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent is just one example where Pacific leaders were attempting to chart a way through this complexity. So the document was described as guiding star for the Pacific, and the strategy declares, and I quote, the need for urgent, immediate, and appropriate action to combat the threat and impacts of climate change, which pressing objective is paired with the need for strengthened ownership and sustainable management and development of the region's natural resources to facilitate socioeconomic growth, improve local livelihoods, right, and strengthen regional sovereignties also in terms of this kind of economic and social base. So central to this ambition is to strengthen the resilience of Pacific economies. And it is a stated need to increase the role of the private sector in areas such as mining, right? The leaders see it as one of the opportunities to meet the other goals. But at the core of it all, Pacific leaders are trying to find ways to assert their sovereign rights and to use and develop their natural and human resources for the benefit of their people, which is sometimes competing with the pressure of global action for climate change, right? And sacrificing certain area in the name of the kind of wider global society. So all of this within this context of compound exposure, existing and emerging threats and vulnerabilities. Now, the patterns, and I know we need time for Q&A, so I'm going to start kind of bringing it all together and wrapping it up now in the best way that I can, I think, here, which is with some questions that we think this provokes and necessitates. So the patterns we have identified in our research points to real possibility that the Pacific could become a sacrifice zone. It could become this, as I mentioned earlier, poorly regulated quarry for the rest of the world. Now, we also are mindful that with Pacific is something that we work, is our region we are interested in. This analysis relates to the Pacific. This analysis could be also replicated for other regions in the world and regional contexts, which was something we wanted to test and make sure. But again, this is the one we're focusing on. So as extractive companies court Pacific leaders and seek access to the resources in the name of global climate solution, we need to really think and ask, who stands to gain the most in those arrangements and who has the most to lose? And are things always the way they seem to be? And as anthropologists, we can look at historical legacies and existing systems that shape directions of travel in the cost-benefit distribution here, and it can give us some hints about, where we've come from and where this might all be going. But this type of vertical analysis we did helps us identify resource-rich regions that are more likely to experience compounding forms of exposure if there is a rush for the resources. Now, this in turn opens up important questions, and some of them you can see on the screen here. What are the critical tipping points at which the combination of extractive effects, climate impacts, and embedded vulnerabilities create a failed state or a series of regional failures? Is it possible to meet global resource requirements without exploiting the most vulnerable regions in the world? And on what basis might it be determined that some regions should be excluded from exploitation? And by whom? Who would make that determination? And if so, if we decide to exclude some regions from resource exploitation, how would we ensure that economic impacts of such exclusion are mitigated? Right, that any lost income through the loss of mining industry is replaced through other forms of platforms for economic development. Now, what Nick and I have been talking about quite a bit with Eleanor and many of our colleagues is that we will need a few things to answer those questions, right? And those things will include novel data infrastructure. And they might include new institutions that are capable of dealing with increased levels of complexity, right? And governing those issues, bringing those different strands together. So what we will need is more cohesive policy and planning processes that connect climate solutions with regional and local risks and look at them together. Now, what we think and what we fear is that the current extractive hegemony that is kind of almost uncritical, yes, we'll mine our way out of it, right? It works to lock us into knowing less and not asking questions at the time when we desperately need to know more, right? And it also locks us into particular pathways rather than encouraging us and creating spaces to explore other pathways forward, such as degrowth, right? Mining and degrowth don't really go together. You won't hear that at industry conferences. So it is like the world is set on this one solution, right? We've got it figured out. We're just going to replace fossil fuel energy with renewable energy, one form of mining with a different form of mining. We don't need to change the way we live. We don't need to change the way we see resources, the way we distribute responsibilities, within our societies, but also globally between the regions. So decision somehow, somewhere, seems to have been made, right? We have our solution. We just need to move on with it and go forward with it now. But is this the right solution? Like, do we actually have enough information and enough knowledge and enough critical space to decide and be able to assess, is this the right one? Now, there are lots of questions for policymakers and regulators that we could consider here. But what I would like to leave you before my last slide is one particularly vexing question that we think is often overlooked, which is the current situation highlights the need for careful policy positions that consider how extractive activities simultaneously support and undermine sustainable development goals and the capacity and capability to manage and adapt to climate change, right? That I think it's a feedback loop and it's a relationship that we don't talk about very often. So just before I move to questions, so The next steps for us, we are working on an edited volume of some fantastic researchers, including some Pacific scholars and thinkers and Pacific artists. So there's going to be an edited volume coming out of ANU Press next year on compound exposure, extractivism, and climate change in the Pacific, where we are trying to go to the ground level. You know, we went from the ethnographic to the big modeling to assert certain patterns, think through big things. And now we're going back to the ethnographic level, working with people of the Pacific to see how it pans out in practice, hoping that this might help us address some of those questions. So this is coming, watch this space. And for now, thank you very much for listening. And if they're open to any questions, are there ants in my laptop is a legitimate question. Elizabeth, anyone working in the Pacific knows that ants go into laptops to get warm, eat through cables. So we can pick any of those questions you like, but you might also have something more relevant to my talk and the subject of the workshop this afternoon. So over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.